12 years, Rebecca had locked away the secret in the deepest corners of her heart. As a respected judge, she buried the memories of her past, convincing herself that the choices she made at 18 were long behind her. But today, the past was about to break free, unleashed by a single moment, a single voice. "You're my mother." A young black boy, no older than 12, was standing before the judge, facing charges for trespassing, a seemingly minor offense that carried far heavier consequences for him. The courtroom was tense that morning. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind of tension that can only be felt when something big is about to unfold. As the prosecutor laid out the case, it seemed like just another typical hearing. But what happened next would shake the courtroom to its core and leave everyone stunned, questioning everything they knew about justice, identity, and the past. The boy's name was Isaiah Turner, a child with a rough past that shaped his every step. His small frame, sitting stiffly in the oversized chair at the defendant's table, looked out of place in the grand courtroom. His worn sneakers, the faded hoodie he wore, and the trembling hands gripping the edge of the table painted a picture of vulnerability. Isaiah had been through more than most kids his age, but the emotional weight of this moment seemed heavier than any burden he'd carried before. His heart raced, his voice unsteady, but he had a secret, a truth he had been carrying with him for years. This was his moment to speak it aloud, to confront the one person he had longed to find for so long. The judge, Rebecca Clark, stood at the center of the storm. Known for her unwavering professionalism and tough stance, Rebecca had a reputation for being particularly harsh when it came to young offenders. Her eyes narrowed as she glanced down at her notes, preparing to address the charges. "Defendant," she began, her voice as crisp and authoritative as ever. "You stand here today accused of trespassing and loitering. How do you plead?" Isaiah, his breath shallow, hesitated before speaking up. "Not guilty," Isaiah finally murmured. His voice was barely audible, but the words echoed in the quiet room, punctuating the air with an undeniable sense of defiance. This courtroom is about to witness a bombshell. If you're intrigued, hit subscribe and join us for the full story. As the prosecutor continued outlining the case, Isaiah's attention drifted. His eyes wandered around the room, scanning the faces of the onlookers. And then they locked onto Rebecca, Judge Clark, his gaze unwavering. For the first time in the hearing, he didn't see her as just a figure of authority. He saw something else. A deep recognition stirred within him, a feeling that both terrified and empowered him. His heart thudded against his chest. This was the moment. Without warning, he stood up, his voice trembling, but his resolve unwavering. "You're my mother," he declared. The room went dead silent. Gasps echoed from every corner as the stunned crowd struggled to process what had just been said. Rebecca Clark froze. Her eyes widened, her pen hovering midair. For the first time in her career, she was completely caught off guard. She blinked, unsure of what to say. "Excuse me?" she stammered, trying to regain control of the room. Isaiah stood firm, his voice breaking but filled with raw emotion. "You're my mother," he repeated. "You gave me away when I was a baby. My foster mom told me everything." The courtroom was paralyzed, and the shock reverberated through the room. The murmurs started slowly, then grew louder as disbelief rippled through the crowd. Rebecca stood frozen, her mind racing. How could this be? How could this boy know something so personal, something she had buried for years? Rebecca's heart pounded in her chest as memories she had worked so hard to forget began to surface. She thought she had locked them away for good, her past, the man she had once been with, the decision to give up her son. She never expected to face this moment. Not here, not now, but there he was, standing before her, his eyes filled with pain and a deep need for answers. As the prosecutor's voice droned on, outlining the charges against Isaiah for trespassing in a gated community, the words seemed to lose their meaning. They were just a background hum, a faint sound fading into oblivion. The real story was unfolding right before their eyes, the one no one had anticipated, the one that would shake the very foundation of everything they knew. Isaiah's mind raced, each second stretching into eternity, as he mustered all the courage he had left. The courtroom, full of expectant eyes, felt suffocating. The murmurs grew louder, and every passing moment felt like a year. His voice cracked as he stood, trembling, trying to steady himself, his gaze never leaving the judge. He had been preparing for this moment his entire life. The years of feeling abandoned, the years spent bouncing from one foster home to the next, the questions that had haunted him since childhood. Today, they would finally be answered. With a deep breath, he spoke again, louder this time. "You're my mother." The words rang out, cutting through the air, silencing the room. The courtroom froze. No one moved. No one spoke. Rebecca, still seated behind the bench, was now staring at him, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. The weight of his words crashed down on her like a tidal wave. She felt a cold sweat break out along her brow as her mind scrambled to make sense of what was happening. How could this be happening? She had buried the secret so deeply, and now here he was, her son, standing before her, claiming the truth that she had kept hidden for years. The courtroom seemed to blur around her. The only thing she could focus on was Isaiah's tear-filled eyes and the desperate look on his face. The room buzzed with whispers, but the sounds were muffled to Rebecca. She couldn't hear anything but the pounding of her own heart. Every word that followed Isaiah's revelation felt distant, as if she were underwater, drowning in a sea of guilt and shock. This revelation is shaking Rebecca to her core. This story is unfolding in ways you never imagined. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss a single moment. Isaiah stood there, his fists clenched at his sides, his chest heaving as he tried to control the wave of emotion that surged through him. He had dreamed of this moment for years, imagined what it would be like to finally confront the woman who had given him life but never returned for him. The prosecutor, unsure of how to proceed, paused, his eyes darting between the judge and the boy. The courtroom had been thrown into chaos, but Rebecca remained motionless, as if paralyzed by the weight of the truth. For a long, agonizing moment, no one said anything. And then, softly, Rebecca spoke. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her voice cold. But there was an unmistakable tremor beneath her words. The world seemed to stand still. The people in the courtroom held their breath, waiting for what would happen next. Isaiah wasn't finished. He had waited too long for this moment. "My foster mom told me everything," he said again, his voice stronger this time. "She said you gave me away because of who I am." The words hung in the air, thick with emotion, cutting through the tension in the room like a knife. The judge, Rebecca, felt a jolt of panic shoot through her body. The truth, her secret, her deepest shame, was now laid bare for the entire courtroom to witness. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, piercing into her soul, and she couldn't escape. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. The world around her blurred as she tried to comprehend what was happening. She had never told anyone about the man she had been involved with, the man whose name she had long since erased from her life. And now this boy, her son, was confronting her with the truth. She had given him away, and he knew why. She could feel the tears threatening to spill from her eyes, but she blinked them back. She couldn't cry here, not in front of them, not in front of him. But deep inside, her heart was breaking. The courtroom was utterly still as the weight of Isaiah's words settled over everyone present. Rebecca's hands trembled at her side, and she could feel her pulse in her ears. For the first time in her career as a judge, she wasn't in control of the situation. She wasn't the one calling the shots. Her mind raced. This couldn't be happening. This boy, her son, was standing in front of her, revealing a secret that had been buried for over a decade. A secret she had tried to forget. A secret that had shaped the choices she made, the life she built, and the very way she saw the world. Rebecca's throat tightened, and she struggled to form words. She was trapped in a web of guilt, shame, and fear. She had always prided herself on being tough, on upholding the law with unwavering authority. But now, in the face of Isaiah's pain and his bold revelation, she felt small, utterly powerless. The audience watched in stunned silence as Rebecca's face turned pale. She couldn't look at Isaiah. She couldn't look at anyone. All she could see was her past, the mistakes she had made, the choices she had forced herself to forget. It all came rushing back to her in a flood of emotions that she had long since pushed aside. Isaiah stood there, waiting for an answer, his face filled with anger and heartbreak. He had spent years in the foster system, bouncing from one home to another, feeling like he was nothing. And now, here she was, the woman who had given him life, standing before him, denying their connection. It was as if his entire life had been a lie. The words caught in Rebecca's throat, and for a moment, she didn't know what to say. The silence in the room was deafening. She was frozen, paralyzed by the gravity of what had just been revealed. Finally, she found her voice, but it was shaky, uncertain. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her tone cold, trying to mask the panic that was rising within her. But even as she spoke those words, a part of her knew. She knew the truth, and it was all too much to bear. Isaiah's eyes never left her. "You don't get to ignore me," he said, his voice shaking with raw emotion. "You don't get to pretend I don't exist." For a brief moment, Rebecca's professional mask cracked. She couldn't hide from the truth any longer. The weight of it all, the guilt, the shame, the regret, pressed down on her like a suffocating force. How could she have let it get this far? How could she have let her career and the judgment of others dictate her life? And yet, as she looked at Isaiah, she couldn't help but see the boy she had once held in her arms. The boy she had given up, believing it was the right choice, believing it was the only way to protect her future. But now, standing in front of him, all of that seemed meaningless. Nothing mattered more than the pain in his eyes and the truth that had been hidden for so long. Rebecca's past coming to light is more painful than anyone could imagine. When she was a young woman, Rebecca was far from the composed and respected judge she had become. Back then, she was simply Rebecca, scared, vulnerable, and uncertain of the world around her. A time when one decision, made out of fear and in the heat of a young woman's turmoil, would set the course for the rest of her life. It was a summer she would never forget. Rebecca was only 18, living in a small town where people whispered about things that didn't align with their ideals. Her relationship with a man named Michael, a man of a different race, had been brief but intense. It was a secret she kept hidden from her family and friends, a relationship that would have consequences she never could have anticipated. Rebecca had always been taught to aspire to greatness, to become something more than her small town. She had dreamed of law school, a future where she would wear the robes of justice with pride. But when she found out she was pregnant, her world flipped upside down. She never expected to be in this position, let alone with a child who would challenge everything she had worked for. Fear gripped her heart as she faced the truth. She had fallen for a man outside her race, and the thought of being pregnant with his child filled her with dread. The world wasn't ready for a child like that, especially not her world, where her career was everything. In a town where racial boundaries ran deep, the thought of a biracial child, the judgment, the rejection, was too much for her to bear. Rebecca's parents were anything but supportive. Their cold, harsh words echoed in her ears. "What will people say? How will you ever be taken seriously in your career? You can't have a child with him." The pressure weighed down on her like a boulder, crushing her every hope. She had no idea how she would survive this. She had no idea how a child would fit into her future, a future that she had meticulously crafted. And so, with a heavy heart, she made the decision to end it all before it even began. She decided to give her baby up for adoption, believing it was the only way to move forward, the only way to escape the shame that would follow her for the rest of her life. That decision, made so long ago, still haunted Rebecca. She had buried it deep inside her, telling herself it was for the best, convincing herself that she was doing what was right for both of them. But now, seeing Isaiah standing in front of her, the truth couldn't stay buried any longer. The young boy she had given away was no longer a baby. He was a young man, and he was demanding answers. The years that followed Rebecca's decision to give up her son were filled with success and hard work. She had built a career as a respected judge, a career she thought would be everything she ever wanted. But deep down, something was missing. Every accolade, every case she won, felt hollow. She had achieved her dreams, but there was a piece of her soul that had been left behind. A piece she had given up when she decided to walk away from Isaiah. Rebecca's professional life became everything she focused on. She surrounded herself with colleagues and mentors who shared her drive and determination. No one knew the truth. No one except her parents and a few close confidants who had been around when she was young. The decision to give up her son, to abandon him, had to stay a secret. She couldn't let anyone know, not in her position, not in a world where racial prejudices ran deep. Every time she entered the courtroom, every time she donned her robe, she felt the weight of her choices pressing on her shoulders. Every legal battle she fought, every decision she made, was always clouded by the memory of the child she had abandoned. But she couldn't let it show. She had worked too hard to let one mistake define her. As time went on, Rebecca convinced herself that the decision she made was for the best. She believed that Isaiah would have a better life with another family, one that could give him the opportunity she couldn't. But she never stopped wondering about him, never stopped thinking about the child she had given up. Yet, despite her best efforts to bury the pain, the shame, and the guilt, she couldn't escape the truth. Every year, as Isaiah grew older, Rebecca's secret began to weigh heavier on her heart. She watched from afar as children around her received the love of their mothers, while she had none to give. She had closed herself off to the possibility of ever being a mother, and yet, here was Isaiah, standing before her, demanding the truth she had hidden for so long. Her heart raced as she tried to hold on to the control she had carefully crafted over the years. But in this moment, in front of Isaiah, she knew she couldn't keep running from her past. The truth had come to find her, and it was too powerful to ignore. At just 18 years old, Rebecca stood at the crossroads of her life, faced with a decision that would alter her future forever. The pregnancy had come as a shock, and the fear of it all was suffocating. She had just started college, and her dreams of becoming a successful lawyer seemed to fade with each passing day. The last thing she had imagined was being pregnant, especially with a child who would complicate everything. The fact that she was carrying the child of Michael, a man she had been with briefly but intensely, only deepened her sense of panic. Michael was black, a fact that Rebecca had never fully considered when they were together. It didn't matter to her at the time, but in the suffocating world of small-town prejudices and expectations, it mattered to everyone else. The weight of her circumstances made Rebecca feel trapped. She had worked so hard to get to where she was. She had dreams of entering law school, a dream that could easily be shattered by the birth of this child. The thought of raising a child with a black man was something she knew would ruin her future, not just professionally but socially. In a community where race was a delicate subject, the judgment would be unbearable. She couldn't risk it. Her parents, ever the voice of conventionality, had been unsupportive, their words harsh and cold. They urged her to think rationally, to see the bigger picture, and to make the choice that was best for her future. "You can't throw your life away over a mistake," they told her. "You're still young. There's so much more you can accomplish without this child." With her career ambitions in mind and the weight of societal pressure bearing down on her, Rebecca made the hardest decision of her life. She chose to give her son up for adoption. It wasn't just a decision, it was a sacrifice, one that she convinced herself would give the child the best life possible. For years, she would tell herself that she did the right thing, that Isaiah had a better chance with another family. But deep down, there was always the gnawing feeling that she had betrayed him, that she had robbed him of the chance to know his real mother, all for the sake of her own career and fears. It's unimaginable to think of the kind of emotional turmoil Rebecca went through. What would you have done in her shoes? Hit that like button and subscribe to follow the emotional twists that lie ahead in this journey. Isaiah, the boy who now stood in front of the judge, had no idea who his mother was. All he knew was that he had been abandoned. From the moment he could understand, he realized that he didn't have the same kind of family that other children had. He bounced from foster home to foster home, each place a fleeting moment of stability before being uprooted again. He was shuffled from one family to the next, never truly feeling wanted, never knowing the comfort of a permanent home. His early years were filled with the pain of rejection and loneliness. He wondered why he never fit in, why no one ever stayed. The question of who his real mother was haunted him, even in his earliest memories. He didn't know her name, didn't know what she looked like, but he felt the emptiness in his chest every time a new family sent him packing. As he grew older, Isaiah became more determined. He wasn't content to simply wonder about his past. He needed answers. He needed to know why his mother had left him. So he learned the law, learned how the system worked, and soon devised a plan. His only chance to meet the woman who had given him life. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only way he could think of. He would trespass. It was a small offense, but it would be enough to get him into the courtroom where his mother was. Isaiah knew the judge's reputation. He had read about her, and so, with nothing but sheer desperation driving him, he made his way to a wealthy neighborhood, an area where he knew he didn't belong, and committed the crime that would get him arrested. His heart pounded as he walked those streets, but he knew it was the only way. This was the only way he would ever get close enough to her, to stand in front of her, to demand the answers he'd waited for all his life. Isaiah sat quietly in the courtroom, his legs shaking with anticipation. He had made it. After all those years of loneliness, of questioning where he came from, of wondering about the woman who gave him life, he was finally in front of her. But it hadn't been easy. The trespassing charge was only a means to an end. A minor offense, but one that would bring him into her world. He had to get arrested, had to make sure they brought him into her courtroom. This was the only way he could finally confront her, to demand the truth. He had been planning this for months. Every move he made, every step he took was calculated to bring him to this moment. His life had been spent in the foster system, but now, standing in front of the woman who had given him up, he felt the weight of every single year of rejection. As the prosecutor spoke, Isaiah couldn't focus on the words. His mind was fixed on one thing only: the woman who sat behind the bench. The woman who had given him life but never once came back for him. He studied her face, trying to make sense of everything he had felt over the years. He had to know, why had she done it? Why had she abandoned him? His heart raced as he stood, his legs unsteady. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words came out in a trembling rush. "You're my mother," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But the weight of the words, the power behind them, was undeniable. The courtroom went still. It was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment that would change everything. Isaiah's pain runs deep. Could you imagine the loneliness he's felt? Subscribe now to see how the truth unfolds when he finally faces the woman who abandoned him. The courtroom fell into an eerie silence as Isaiah's words echoed through the room. "You're my mother," he repeated, his voice shaking but resolute. The air grew thick with tension as the room processed the gravity of what had just been said. Isaiah's declaration had shattered the normal order of the courtroom. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The judge, Rebecca, stood frozen at the bench, her face a mix of disbelief and confusion. The audience, once a sea of murmurs, was now absolutely still, waiting for the next move. Rebecca, known for her stern demeanor, found herself utterly disarmed. She had handled countless cases, had dealt with criminals and lawbreakers without flinching. But this was something different. This was personal. Her heart pounded as she tried to make sense of Isaiah's words. Could it be true? Could this boy really be the son she had given up so many years ago? Isaiah's eyes never left hers, and in them, Rebecca saw a pain that no child should have to carry. His soul, so young, had been burdened with the weight of abandonment for years. And now, standing before her, he was demanding answers. He had come for the truth. The silence stretched on, but in that moment, Rebecca couldn't speak. Her mind raced, trying to process what was happening. She had buried her past so deeply, built an entire life to cover up the decision she had made, the child she had left behind. And now, that past was standing before her, demanding recognition. For the first time in her career, Rebecca felt completely out of control. This was no ordinary case. As a judge, she was accustomed to keeping her emotions in check, to maintaining a professional distance. But now, in the face of this revelation, She couldn't contain what was rising inside her. She looked at Isaiah, and for the first time, she didn't see a case number or a young boy who had made a mistake. She saw a child, her child, the one she had given up all those years ago. Her chest tightened as her professional facade began to crack. In his eyes, she saw a reflection of her own fear, regret, and the years of shame she had carried since the day she made the choice to let him go. Isaiah's words echoed in her mind like a drumbeat, relentless and unyielding. "You're my mother," he had said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of truth. And in that moment, Rebecca knew that she could no longer deny it. The child she had abandoned was now here, in front of her, demanding answers. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat as she struggled to maintain her composure. She could feel the heat rising to her face, the rush of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She had always told herself that she had done the right thing, that giving Isaiah up for adoption had been the best choice for him. But standing here now, in front of him, with all of his pain and longing so palpable, Rebecca could no longer justify her actions. The guilt and shame she had buried for so long surfaced with a vengeance, and she felt the weight of her past decisions crash down on her. In an attempt to regain control, Rebecca's instinct was to deny what had just happened. She couldn't let the truth unfold in front of an entire courtroom. She couldn't allow herself to be exposed. So, she did what came naturally to her. She tried to shut it down. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice cold and distant, her eyes avoiding Isaiah's pleading gaze. She wanted to believe that this was some kind of misunderstanding, some sort of fantasy that Isaiah had created in his mind. She needed to believe that. If she didn't, everything she had worked for, the career she had built, the life she had made, would come crashing down. The courtroom, however, was no longer just a place of judgment. It had become a stage for a much more personal and painful drama. The audience watched with bated breath, sensing the shift in the room, the raw vulnerability that was now exposed. The prosecutor, who had once been so focused on the case, now stood frozen, unsure of how to proceed. Isaiah's face fell as Rebecca denied him. He had been prepared for this, prepared for rejection, but the sting of her cold words was still unbearable. His heart ached as he stood there, vulnerable and exposed, in front of the woman who had abandoned him. But even as the words of denial left her lips, Rebecca felt something stir within her, a feeling she had suppressed for so long. The truth, no matter how hard it was to face, was undeniable, and deep down she knew it. Isaiah, his heart shattered by the rejection, stood before the judge, his trembling hands clutching the edge of the table. His voice, barely above a whisper, cut through the tense silence. "My foster mom told me everything. She said you gave me away because of who I am." His words, laced with years of pain and bitterness, struck a chord in the courtroom, hanging in the air like a weighted stone. Rebecca's heart pounded in her chest as if her very soul had been pierced by the truth. The words she had feared to hear, the ones she had pushed out of her mind for so long, had now become the harsh reality of her life. Everything she had worked so hard to hide, to bury under layers of success and power, was being dragged to the surface. She felt the room close in on her as the walls of her carefully constructed life began to crack. Her gaze flickered to Isaiah's tear-streaked face, his eyes full of the anger and confusion that came from a lifetime of abandonment. He wasn't just accusing her. He was revealing the truth she had fought so hard to forget. The judge, for the first time, didn't have an answer. She couldn't hide behind her robe, her title, or her authority. All that was left was the woman who had made a choice all those years ago, a choice that had destroyed both of their lives. Rebecca's stomach twisted in agony. She had always convinced herself that it was the right decision, that Isaiah would have a better life. But now, as she saw the pain in his eyes, she realized how wrong she had been. She wasn't just a judge. She was a mother who had abandoned her son. As the weight of Isaiah's words sank in, Rebecca felt the full force of her guilt and shame come rushing to the surface. The tight grip she had maintained over her emotions for so many years started to slip. Her professional composure was no longer enough to shield her from the truth she had so desperately avoided. The judge's mind raced back to the moment when she had made the decision to give Isaiah up for adoption. She was just 18, scared and vulnerable, with a future she thought was at stake. She had fallen in love with a man who, in that small town, was considered an outsider. A brief but passionate affair led to an unplanned pregnancy, and when she found herself with child, she was terrified. The fear of rejection, the fear of ruining her career, and the fear of how society would perceive her as a young woman with a black child. All of these fears had led her to the painful choice of giving Isaiah up. It wasn't an easy decision, but she thought it was the only one she could make. Now, standing before Isaiah, those years of guilt came crashing down. She could feel the weight of her actions, the actions that had shaped his life into something full of hurt and rejection. She had chosen her career over him, and it was a decision she would never be able to undo. Tears welled up in Rebecca's eyes as she finally allowed herself to feel the depth of her remorse. She had told herself it was the right thing to do, but now, looking at Isaiah, she knew it wasn't. She had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way. The weight of the revelation, the overwhelming flood of emotions, became too much for Rebecca to bear. Her breath became shallow as the room seemed to spin around her. She could feel the heat of her shame flush across her face, her chest tight with the pressure of the moment. I need a moment," she stammered, her voice cracking under the emotional strain. Without waiting for a response, she slammed her gavel down with a resounding thud. "Recess," she declared, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain authoritative. The murmurs in the courtroom erupted, but Rebecca didn't wait to hear them. She pushed through the door, practically stumbling into her chambers, her knees weak under the heavy load of guilt. Behind her, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. The audience could hardly believe what had just unfolded before them. A young boy accusing a judge of abandoning him, of being his mother. It was a story no one could have expected, and yet here it was unraveling in real time. The tension was palpable. As she entered her chambers, Rebecca's mind was a whirlwind. The thoughts came too fast for her to process, but one thing was clear. She could no longer hide from the past. She had been forced to confront the very thing she had spent years running from. Isaiah was her son, and the pain and regret she had carried for so long were now impossible to ignore. The walls of her chambers felt suffocating. She sat behind her desk, her hands shaking as she tried to steady herself. Memories of that time flooded her mind, her desperation, the decision to give Isaiah up, the fear that had driven her actions. She had buried it all, convinced herself that it was the right choice. But now, in the face of Isaiah's pain, Rebecca knew that the cost of her decision was far greater than she had ever imagined. Guilt and regret are hard to escape. Can Rebecca find redemption in this moment? Hit subscribe and stay tuned to see if she'll face the consequences of her past decisions. Isaiah sat in the defendant's chair, his body rigid with the weight of the truth he had just exposed. The courtroom had become eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses down on your chest, making it hard to breathe. He could hear the faint murmur of voices from the other side of the door, but none of it mattered. None of it changed the fact that his whole life had been a lie that he had just shattered in front of everyone. He sat there, looking at the polished wooden table, his thoughts swirling in painful, dizzying circles. He could still hear her words echoing in his mind. "I don't know what you're talking about." Her denial, the coldness in her eyes, the very woman who had given him life, who should have protected him, had abandoned him and erased his existence. For a long time, Isaiah had told himself that this day would come, the day he would finally face her, confront her, and demand the answers he deserved. But now, sitting in that courtroom, he wasn't sure if he was ready for the truth. He wasn't sure if he could handle the rejection, the silence, the hollow absence where a mother's love should have been. All he had wanted was to know why. Why had she never come back for him? Why had she allowed him to be tossed from home to home, never giving him a chance at a real family, at a real life? Isaiah's eyes flickered toward the door where Rebecca had just left. The hope that had burned in him so brightly moments ago was now dimming, replaced with a deep sadness. He had fought so hard to find her, but now that she was finally in front of him, he didn't know if he could bear the weight of her rejection. Alone in her chambers, Rebecca felt the full weight of Isaiah's words press down on her like an iron fist. She had locked away her past for so long, hoping that time would somehow erase the memories, that her success and her title as a respected judge would keep the truth buried. But now, standing in the solitude of her office, she realized that no amount of power could shield her from the consequences of her past. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she closed her eyes, allowing herself to remember. The memories flooded back, one after another, each one more painful than the last. The man she had once loved, the one she had been so terrified to be with. He had been everything she had wanted, but the fear of society's judgment, of how a relationship with a black man would ruin her future, had driven her to make a decision she would never be able to undo. She had told herself that giving Isaiah up was the right thing. He would have a better life in a loving home, away from the judgmental eyes of the community. But as the years passed, she couldn't stop thinking about him, the child she had abandoned, the child who had every right to know his mother. Rebecca's hands shook as she reached for a drawer, pulling out an old photo, faded and worn from years of neglect. It was a picture of a newborn, wrapped tightly in a yellow blanket, his small, innocent face so full of promise. She had once held him in her arms, and in that moment, she had made the hardest decision of her life. Now, holding that photo, the weight of her past was unbearable. She had convinced herself that it had been the right choice, that it had been necessary for her career. But looking at the picture, she saw a mother who had made a choice that had cost her everything. The life of her son, her peace of mind, and the love she had longed for. As Rebecca sat at her desk, her thoughts a tangled mess of guilt and regret, she realized something. The decision she had made all those years ago had shaped the course of her life, and Isaiah's, into a tragedy. But this was her moment to change it, to face the truth, no matter how painful, and perhaps, for the first time, take responsibility for her actions. She stood, her legs shaky beneath her as she crossed the room to the mirror. The woman staring back at her wasn't just the judge, the respected figure in the courtroom. No, she was someone else now, someone who had been hiding for far too long. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but there was no turning back. She had spent years running from this moment, from the son she had abandoned, but now she knew she couldn't keep avoiding it. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay when there was a child out there, waiting for her, hoping that she would one day return. Isaiah deserved the truth. He deserved to know why she had left him and what had really happened all those years ago. It was the least she could do. As Rebecca walked back into the courtroom, her heart pounding in her chest, she made a promise to herself. No more running, no more hiding. It was time to face the past, to look Isaiah in the eye, and to take the first step toward healing. As Rebecca returned to the courtroom, the tension was unbearable. The air seemed to thicken with the weight of the moment. Each step she took echoing louder than the last. She moved toward the bench, her usual commanding presence gone, replaced by a vulnerability that even the most seasoned courtroom observers could not ignore. She stood for a moment, gathering herself, and then her voice, usually steady and firm, cracked as she addressed Isaiah. Isaiah? Her eyes brimmed with tears, and for the first time, she saw him, not as a defendant, not as a case to be handled, but as her son. I owe you an apology, she began, her voice breaking. A big one. I was scared. Scared of what people would think. Scared of ruining my career. She swallowed hard, her hands trembling as they rested on the table in front of her. I didn't know how to face you, and I didn't know how to face what I had done. The courtroom was eerily quiet, each word she spoke carving through the silence like a blade. There was no longer any pretense, no cold professionalism. Just a woman broken by her past, trying to find the strength to make it right. I didn't know how to be your mother, Rebecca admitted, the weight of those words bringing the tears that had been held back for so long to the surface. I didn't know what I was doing, and I thought that leaving you was the only way to protect us both. Isaiah, who had braced himself for anger and rejection, now felt his heart ache. He'd waited years for this moment, never once thinking he would hear those words from her. He didn't speak right away. His emotions were a mix of disbelief, confusion, and a deep, growing sorrow. But there was something else in her words, a hint of vulnerability, a desire for connection. Isaiah could barely find the words. His heart was racing, emotions swelling, and everything he had built up for so many years, anger, resentment, pain, began to crack. Rebecca's apology had hit him in a place he didn't even know existed inside himself. As he stood before her, his tears started to fall. For the first time, they weren't tears of anger, but tears of something softer, something tender, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He looked into her eyes, searching for something, anything that would tell him whether he could trust her again. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Isaiah whispered, his voice shaking. "But I've waited so long for this. I don't know what to feel right now." Rebecca's heart wrenched as she watched him, standing there, so full of pain. He had every right to be angry, to feel betrayed. But here he was, standing before her and showing the rawness of a broken heart. She reached out with shaking hands, as if afraid he might disappear if she didn't touch him. "Isaiah," she whispered, stepping toward him. "I can't change what I did, but I can try. If you'll let me, I'll try to be the mother you deserve." Before she could say more, Isaiah took a trembling step forward, his face tear-streaked, but his eyes now filled with a glimmer of something new, hope. He didn't respond with words, but instead, he reached out and pulled Rebecca into a hug. Rebecca gasped, stunned for a moment, but then she closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, she let herself be enveloped in the warmth of a hug she'd never imagined she would have again. They held each other tightly, both of them trembling, overwhelmed with a flood of emotions. Rebecca clung to him as if holding on would somehow make everything right again. "I'm so sorry, Isaiah. I'm so sorry," she murmured, unable to stop the tears from flowing freely. "I know," Isaiah whispered through his sobs. "I know." The hug between Rebecca and Isaiah lasted longer than either of them had expected. Neither wanted to let go, as if holding each other was the only way to make sense of the chaos of the last few moments. But slowly, as the tears began to subside, they pulled away just enough to look at each other. Isaiah wiped his eyes, trying to compose himself, and for the first time, he allowed himself to soften. "I want to try," he said quietly, almost shyly. "I want to know who you really are. Not the judge, not the woman who left me. I want to know you, the real you." Rebecca, her chest tight with emotion, nodded, her heart swelling with something she hadn't dared feel for years. "Hope. Then let's take it one step at a time," she said softly. "I know it's not going to be easy, but we'll do this together. One step at a time." Isaiah nodded, his hand reaching out to take hers. Their fingers brushed awkwardly at first, then settled into a firm grip. The simple connection, the rawness of it, spoke volumes. They were not healed, not yet, but they were willing to try. "I don't know where this is going," Isaiah admitted, "but I don't want to be angry anymore. I don't want to hold onto the past." Rebecca squeezed his hand, her heart full. "Neither do I. I just want to be here for you now, Isaiah. I'll never leave you again." For the first time, Isaiah felt a flicker of trust. The road ahead was long, and there would be challenges, but they were facing it together, and that was more than he had ever hoped for. As they stood there, hand in hand, the weight of their shared past seemed to lift just a little, replaced by a fragile but undeniable bond. They weren't looking at the past anymore. They were looking at the future they could build starting now. The courtroom had emptied, but the journey for Rebecca and Isaiah was far from over. They had taken their first steps toward healing, but both knew that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. The weight of the years lost, the moments Isaiah had spent wondering why his mother had never come for him, was not something that could be easily erased. As they left the courthouse, hand in hand, the world seemed both uncertain and full of possibility. They didn't have the answers to everything, and there was still so much to work through. But for the first time in their lives, they were standing together, as mother and son. Isaiah couldn't help but think about all the years he had spent alone, bouncing between foster homes, never knowing where he truly belonged. The empty ache he had carried in his heart for so long was still there, but now it was different. There was a sliver of hope, a faint glimmer that he could finally begin to understand who he was and where he came from. Rebecca, too, was struggling to process the magnitude of the situation. She had built her life carefully, focusing on her career and the persona she had worked so hard to create. But in this moment, she understood that no amount of professional success or external achievements could make up for the years she had lost with her son. Still, she was determined to be there for him, to make up for the time they had missed. Neither of them knew where this journey would take them, but they were both willing to try. Every step they took from this moment forward would be a step toward rebuilding their relationship, no matter how difficult or painful it might be. As the days passed, Rebecca spent a great deal of time reflecting on the choices she had made in her past, the ones that had led her to this point. Her thoughts constantly returned to the decision she had made all those years ago, when she was a scared 18-year-old girl, pregnant and unsure of what to do. Her parents had pressured her, telling her that giving up the baby was the only way forward, the only way to protect her future. At the time, it had seemed like the only logical option. A career in law, especially as a judge, required a spotless reputation. She couldn't risk having a child with a man who wasn't acceptable in the eyes of society, especially not a black man. It wasn't that she was racist. It was that she feared how people would view her. She feared the consequences for her career and her life. But now, as she sat in her quiet home, the weight of those decisions hit her harder than ever. She had never allowed herself to truly feel the depth of her guilt until now, standing in front of Isaiah. She had tried to bury it, to convince herself that she had made the right choice. But deep down, she had always known that abandoning her son had been a mistake. The realization that she could never undo what she had done was a hard pill to swallow. The life she had worked so hard to build felt hollow, because it was built on the sacrifice of the one person she had never been able to forget. Rebecca knew she couldn't change the past, but she also knew that she couldn't let it define her. She had a chance to try again, to be a part of Isaiah's life, and she wasn't going to let that slip away. Her heart ached as she thought about the years Isaiah had spent wondering why she hadn't come back for him. The years of loneliness and abandonment he had endured. She could never give him back those years, but she could be there for him now. She could be the mother he deserved, even if it was too late to erase the past. Isaiah had never allowed himself to hope. For years, he had carried the burden of rejection, the idea that no one would ever truly love him, especially not the woman who had given him life. But now, as he stood at the beginning of something new, something uncertain, he felt a sense of something he hadn't felt in so long: hope. He wasn't sure where it came from. He wasn't sure if it was because of the gentle way Rebecca had spoken to him or the way she had looked at him with tears in her eyes. All Isaiah knew was that, for the first time, he didn't feel so alone. He wasn't just a boy lost in the system anymore. He was the son of a woman who, despite everything, wanted to try again. It was a strange feeling for Isaiah, one that he couldn't quite understand. How could he let go of all the anger and resentment that had built up inside him for years? How could he forgive a woman who had abandoned him, left him to grow up without her? He still had questions, so many questions. But there was something different now, something that made him believe that maybe they could build something together, something that would last. For the first time, Isaiah allowed himself to picture a future where he wasn't just a victim of his past, but someone who could finally, truly belong. The pieces of his life had been scattered, broken, and torn apart for so long. But now there was a chance, a real chance, that those pieces could fit together again. Rebecca's words echoed in his mind, the promise that she would be there for him now, that she wouldn't walk away. The road ahead would be long and full of obstacles, but at least he didn't have to face it alone anymore. Rebecca had always thought she would be judged by the world for the decisions she had made, about giving up her child, about choosing her career over motherhood. She had spent so many years trying to live up to the expectations of others, to build a life that was perfectly in line with what society demanded. But none of that mattered now. She had Isaiah standing before her, broken, hurt, and full of questions, but also willing to try. And for the first time in years, Rebecca felt a sense of relief. She couldn't change the past, and she wouldn't be able to erase the pain she had caused him. But she could choose to be there for him now. She could choose to make things right, even if it was just the first step on a long and difficult road. Her heart swelled with a mix of emotions: guilt, hope, and a deep sense of longing. This was her chance to be the mother Isaiah had always needed. She couldn't give him the years they had lost, but she could give him the love and support he had always deserved. As Rebecca looked at Isaiah, she felt the weight of her choices, but also the possibility of redemption. It wasn't going to be easy. It was going to take time, patience, and a lot of work. But for the first time, she believed that they could build something together. A relationship, a bond that had been broken but could be mended. And so, with tears in her eyes and a heart full of determination, Rebecca took the first step. She reached out to Isaiah, her hand trembling as she rested it on his shoulder. "I'm here, Isaiah," she said softly. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. We'll figure this out together." Isaiah looked up at her, his face still unsure but softening. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could have something real. The courtroom was nearly empty now, the echoes of the day's events fading into the quiet halls. But for Rebecca and Isaiah, everything had changed. Their journey, though just beginning, was already unfolding in unexpected ways. They had started with so much pain, so much uncertainty, but now there was something new between them. The beginning of a mother-son bond, one that was fragile yet full of potential. They walked out of the courtroom together, their steps tentative but steady. Rebecca's heart was heavy with the knowledge that they had a long road ahead of them. But as they walked hand in hand, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Hope that they could rebuild their relationship, step by step, day by day. Isaiah, too, walked with a different kind of strength. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, he wasn't facing it alone. He had his mother, the woman he had dreamed of meeting for so long, and now they were standing together, ready to face whatever came next. There were still many questions left unanswered, many wounds still to be healed. But in this moment, as they walked together into an uncertain future, there was a quiet understanding between them. The past could never be erased, but the future could be shaped. With each step, they moved further from the pain of the past and closer to a future they could build together. A new beginning isn't always easy, but it's worth it. If you believe in second chances and redemption, give us a thumbs up and subscribe to follow more stories like this.